This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're talking all about Artur Akhtyamov. But before we get to that, I just want to apologize for the little break that we had there in the Camp Countdown. I ended up going home for the past week, was away from my recording setup, so I wasn't able to backlog anything to get those up last week. So I took the week off to kind of ramp up this week, then had a couple busy days over the weekend and starting the work week. So wasn't quite able to get things out on Monday or Tuesday, but we're back and very, very excited for this kind of home stretch leading into the start of training camp. And then, of course, all throughout training camp, the preseason and into the regular season. We'll have a special episode later this week previewing the Prospect Showdown. So I hope that kind of makes up for the lack of activity the past week. And we're kicking things off with a bang and a great episode on Artur Akhtyamov, a very intriguing goaltending prospect out of Russia that we will see come to North America and actually see play this weekend at that aforementioned Prospect Showdown. He signed last year after some really intriguing, as I mentioned, an intriguing goaltending prospect, but after some really good results in Russia, but kind of in a unique way that I'll get to in a little bit. He returned to Russia last season in the KHL and played a little bit with Akbar's Kazan in the KHL, but was mainly the third string guy in the VHL with Neftenik Almatyvsk. And so when he returned last season, it's kind of one of those things where we see it pretty often with some of these KHL or just kind of generally European players where there will be an agreement with the team that they'll sign their NHL contract but return to their kind of parent club in Europe. It's something we see pretty common. We saw it actually recently with Roni Hirvonen. We saw it with Dennis Hildeby for a year. We saw it with Topi Niemela as well. It happens pretty commonly for some of these European prospects. And so Akhtyamov went back to Russia last season, played a little bit in the KHL. He got that opportunity due to some injuries in the KHL. But again, like I said, mainly played in the VHL. He had a .921 save percentage in 17 games in the KHL, a .927 save percentage in 19 games with Neftenik in the VHL, which, if you're unclear of what that level is, you've got the KHL, which is like the NHL in Russia, you've got the VHL, which is like the AHL in Russia, and then you have the MHL, which is the Junior League. The Junior League, not really relevant for this conversation about Akhtyamov. But the main point is that he remained with Neftenik into the playoffs, and he was spectacular for them in the postseason. He went 16-5 in the playoffs, had a .932 save percentage, 2 shutouts in 21 games en route to winning not only the VHL championship, but playoff MVP as well. This coming as a 22-year-old goaltender for pretty much the entire season. He's a late October birthday. In fact, he's born on Halloween. So basically 22 for the entire season. And so the season before this year, leading into him signing his entry-level contract, in 39 games with Neftenik, he had a .943 save percentage, had 6 shutouts in that season, and in 6 playoff games, had a .952 save percentage, and actually had 2 shutouts in that playoff run, and those were the only 2 wins that his team got. So a very, very impressive season leading into him signing his entry-level contract. And before that, he had some pretty good results since being drafted back in 2020 in the 4th round, 106th overall. You go to his draft year. He had a .931 save percentage in the Russian Junior League. His draft plus 1 season, he got some KHL games. He got some VHL games. He got some MHL games. He was the backup goaltender for Russia at the World Juniors, the last time that they actually played at the World Juniors, and was the backup to Yaroslav Askarov at that tournament. And so you look over his history in Russia, and it's always been kind of very consistent, really good results. And then the last 2 years have really kind of taken that next step to that kind of elite level numbers in the VHL and getting that KHL opportunity a little bit last season. I mentioned earlier that was partially due to some injuries. The 2 main goaltenders in Kazan were Timur Bilyalov, who had been kind of an established goaltender in the Kazan system, and Amir Miftakov as well. And those were the 2 kind of primary goaltenders for Kazan that were expected to be the starter and backup just because they're actually signed to Kazan and weren't really a situation like Akhtyamov where he would be there for one more season and then leave. So he's the third string goaltender and got into games because both of those goaltenders got injured throughout the season and went 6-7 in those games. One shutout, a .921 save percentage, and 17 total appearances. Pretty good numbers overall in the KHL. So I say all of that to kind of backtrack as well. I've been talking about how good and consistent his numbers have been. The thing that is intriguing about Akhtyamov is that he's kind of taking this unique path where we haven't seen any NHL goaltenders play in the VHL this long since the VHL and this current iteration came into existence back in 2010. So we've got a pretty good sample of 14 going on 15 years of this league. Plenty of goaltenders that have been drafted to the NHL coming through that league and that system. And there aren't really a lot of goaltenders, if any goaltenders, that have played primarily in this league and have gone on to NHL success. You look at Yaroslav Askarov, at 17 years old, played 18 games in the VHL. Vadim Zherenko, a pretty good goaltending prospect for the Blues, at 19 years old, played 25 games in the VHL. The same for Daniil Tarasov, played 25 games at 19 years old. Pyotr Kochetkov, 19 years old, played 18 games at this level. The only goaltenders to play in the NHL that have also played a notable amount of games past their teenage years in the VHL. Igor Shesterkin at 20 years old, played 25 games in the VHL. He also had a .954 save percentage in that season. And then that's pretty much it. You have some guys that played kind of spot games in the NHL. Alexei Melnichuk, Georgi Romanov, who's currently with the Sharks. Those are the only two. Artyom Zagadulin as well played a game or two with the Flames. So there's a few guys that got onto NHL rosters, signed NHL contracts, that played in the VHL past their teenage years, but there aren't any that played kind of primarily in that league past that point that have gone on to play in the NHL like Akhtyamov has. You look at his history at 19, 20, 21, and 22 years old, the league that he played the most games in throughout each of those seasons was the VHL. There isn't anyone that you can point to that has played primarily in the NHL to this point that has taken that same path. For the most part, the elite goaltending prospects in Russia have gone the junior league and either straight to the KHL or have taken kind of a pit stop in the VHL for a quarter, a third, a half of a season, but not kind of over multiple seasons like Akhtyamov has. I say that, but there is one goaltender that might be bucking that trend, and his name is Ivan Fedotov. Of course, you might not be super familiar with him, but he's the Flyers goaltender that kind of had the weird couple of seasons where he signed an NHL contract, but then was forced to stay in Russia, and the IIHF had kind of ruling on the validity of his contracts, and the IIHF ruled in favor of the Flyers, but then he stayed in Russia still. At the end of the day, he's now in the NHL, and he made his debut at the end of last season, played in 3 games to not very good results, but it was also at the end of a very turbulent time in his career, and he got a $3.25 million contract to stay in North America and to see what he can do with the Philadelphia Flyers. And actually $3.275 million, so even a little bit more than that. Fedotov, at the same age as Akhtyamov, was still in the VHL. That was 2018-19 for him. He had a .929 save percentage in 26 games with Toros Neftekamsk and actually had significantly fewer minutes in the KHL at the same age. He'd only made 2 starts in the KHL by that point, and you compare that to Akhtyamov, who played in 17 games this past season. So significantly different in terms of their experience at the same point. And the results are much better for Akhtyamov over the same span as Fedotov. You look at Fedotov, and at 21 years old, he had an .899 save percentage in the VHL. Compare that to Akhtyamov, who had a sky-high .943. Of course, very different environments, but it's worth noting. Fedotov, after that age 22 season, makes the jump to Track Tour after being in the Salavet Ulayev UFA system, makes the jump to Traktor Chelyabinsk, and plays in the KHL and has a .931 save percentage in 32 games. And he basically becomes a legit KHL starter on kind of the top tier echelon of goaltenders in that league, plays for Russia eventually at the Olympic Games, moves to CSKA Moscow, and then of course has kind of the weird stuff with the Flyers after being a Flyers draft pick way back in 2015. All of that to say, Akhtyamov has taken a unique path in terms of being a goaltender that has stayed primarily in the second tier Russian league. And the only other goaltender that looks like they're going to have an NHL career that has taken that same path over the 14 going on 15-year history of that league is Ivan Fedotov, who was just coming over to the NHL now. And the big difference between the two is Fedotov is 6'8" and Akhtyamov is 6'1". Vastly different in terms of how you would expect a goaltender to develop in terms of those two sizes. You expect the larger goaltender to take longer in terms of figuring out and growing into the body, figuring out how to play the position properly at that size and kind of maintain your health and maintain your ability over the course of a season versus somebody like Akhtyamov, who's closer in size to like your Igor Shesterkin's types who were elite goaltenders in the KHL at the same age as what Akhtyamov is now. But he's coming over to the North American ranks this year. So we will get to see, after years of kind of being like, yeah, he's playing very good, but also at a questionable level. How good is he actually? We're going to find that out now because so many goaltenders put up great results in Russian leagues. There are so many goaltenders that have .920, .930, even up to .940 save percentages. We're going to see what Akhtyamov is made of this upcoming season. And we're going to see it as soon as this weekend, which is going to be his first action in North America since back in 2020 when in the World Junior ranks when he played one game against Austria. So it's been a very long time for him, and he's going to be doing it in the Bell Center. Not a bad way to make your debut. I'm curious to see if he gets a full game and kind of can start that adjustment period to North American ice and kind of get that game action, or if we'll see Hildeby get that full game and Akhtyamov and Peksa will split the net. And actually, speaking of Peksa, he was drafted out of the same system as Akhtyamov a year later. They're basically the same age, a few months difference in age, and they played together on the same MHL team for a little bit in the Kazan system. So these are two guys that are good friends, and I'm very excited to see kind of how they develop alongside each other because that would be a really fun story if both of them end up panning out. So going into the season, Akhtyamov, I don't really know what to expect from him. Like I mentioned, we haven't really seen any of these goaltenders come over to North America after this long in the Russian second tier league, and Fedotov is doing it after playing in the KHL for many years after kind of being in the VHL at that same age. So it's a very different adjustment for Akhtyamov as well. And it's probably better he's making the adjustment now, doing so at a younger age and with longer runway to develop into a potential NHL role. He's going to probably play with the Marlies, although I could see some action with the ECHL affiliate in Cincinnati to potentially start the season and then grow into a role with the Marlies, depending on how training camp, the preseason, some elements like that go, as well as kind of the availability of goaltenders with the Marlies. It'll be Hildeby as the clear-cut starter. Matt Murray's status remains unclear, and then it's Artur Akhtyamov right there. So if Matt Murray is somebody that is ready to play a consistent role, we could see Akhtyamov maybe start the season in the ECHL, but given he's going to be 23 already at the end of October, it's probably best to see what he can do in the AHL sooner rather than later in this first season in North America. We had a rookie goaltender steal the spotlight last year in Hildeby with the Marlies. Wasn't really expected coming into the season, given kind of the logjam of Martin Jones being there, the question mark of what Matt Murray would be, and then him eventually being ruled out for the season, and then Keith Petruzzelli being the established guy there, Luke Kavalin looking to steal some minutes. Eventually, it became Hildeby's net, and he took the reins and went with it. It's going to be more difficult for Akhtyamov to have that same impact on the Marlies just because Hildeby is the established guy there, but there's also less kind of logjam for him to pass guys on the depth chart. So I'm very excited to see what we get from Akhtyamov as soon as this weekend, but especially over the course of the entire season. I've been tracking his games for a while, been clipping his highlights. He can make athletic saves. He can also play a calmer style. He kind of feels like a mix between the chaotic style of a Slava Peksa and a calm demeanor of the massive Dennis Hildeby. At 6'1", you kind of have to be a marriage of those two. You can't kind of just be that calm goaltender because you don't fill as much of the net, but you also can't necessarily be the pure chaos Dominik Hasek goaltender because there's only like one of those ever. So for Akhtyamov, I hope that we see him in a preseason game or two. I hope we see him get some run with the Marlies, and I hope for his sake we see him get consistent minutes this season because he is coming over from a season where played a little bit in the KHL, played a little bit in the VHL, had a great end of the season, can build off of that coming over to North America. It's going to be a difficult transition. It was for Slava Peksa, but Peksa also didn't have as much experience against professional athletes as Akhtyamov has coming over to the AHL. And like I mentioned earlier, he's going to be 23 at the end of October. This isn't a situation where it's a 21-year-old goaltender who is going to play in the minor league system for 4 or 5 years before kind of making a push for an NHL roster spot. This is a guy that's going to be 23 by the end of October. He is very much in the same age range as Dennis Hildeby. You look at Dennis Hildeby, he is an August 2001 birth date, even though he was drafted 2 years after Akhtyamov. Hildeby is actually a little bit older than him. They're essentially the same age. You're talking about a goaltender that was born mid-August of 2001 and a goaltender born at the end of October in 2001. So it is very fair to compare the two in terms of their development. Hildeby already has that full season with the Marlies under his belt and is the de facto number one coming into this season. He has the size advantage. He has that kind of professional NHL style build to him. Akhtyamov is coming from a much more unique path and an unproven path and a goaltender that I don't think a lot of people really know what to expect from him coming into this season. Yeah, he's had consistent results in Russia, but we also don't really know what that means coming over to North America, being a VHL goaltender at his age. So among the prospects coming to the Marlies this upcoming season, yeah, you'll look at the Fraser Mintons, and those kind of players are going to be the more impactful players long-term in terms of them reaching their ceilings for the Maple Leafs, most likely. But among the players coming to the Marlies and playing their first professional seasons, either at all or specifically in the Leafs organization, there aren't many, if any, players I am more fascinated to see what they do than Artur Akhtyamov. And so I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on the show to talk about Akhtyamov than probably his biggest fan in the entire world, and especially in the Leafs sphere, and that is the Leafs Nation's Filipe Dimas. Very excited to get to that conversation with Filipe all about Artur Akhtyamov, his favorite goaltender in the world. Very excited to welcome on, I think, the world's biggest Artur Akhtyamov fan, Filipe Dimas, to talk all about his favorite goalie. Filipe, thanks for taking some time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kyle. I was just saying kind of in the pre-call, I love that my random passion for this obscure Russian goalie has earned me a bit of a reputation online.
It is the best. Every time I post anything related to Akhtyamov, I always wait for the like or the repost or anything from you, because I know what's coming, and it is awesome. Like, it's so much fun that now he's coming over to North America, and now you don't have to wait for random 10 a.m. clips to see Akhtyamov play. So I think it's probably best to start with how your fandom and appreciation for Akhtyamov's game kind of started. Obviously, we've kind of joked about it. He's definitely one of your guys that you've kind of on just kind of the online space consistently supported and been like, this is one of my guys. This is somebody that I think is going to make it. When did that kind of start to happen for you with Akhtyamov?
Yeah, so I remember, like most hockey fans, I go into the draft with the knowledge of like the top guys or the guys around when my team is expected to pick. Like, I look around the kind of the draft prospects and go like, okay, I want my team to select this guy because he's projected around that range and seems like a guy like. So admittedly, I didn't know anything about him going in. I'm not going to know anything about minor league goalies in the Russian system, let alone
Exactly.
ones going in the fourth round. But when the selections are made, I'd like to do the typical online scouting, see if I can find clips, see if I can find stats and stuff. And his really jumped out to me being like, oh, wait, these are not too bad for I believe 18 years old at the time, goaltender.
Yeah.
And I've always been a believer of like the goaltending position is so volatile, it's so chaotic. It's worth sending a flyer on a goaltending draft pick every year, if or every 2 years at least. I think like every 3 years that pass by, an NHL team should draft at least two goalies. Like just send out flyers and like I think my proof of concept with that is the last three Vesna winners are all like fourth round or later draft picks.
Yeah.
Like you're getting superstar goalies selected in the mid to late rounds. Like all three of those guys were drafted after where Akhtyamov was selected. So it's worth a flyer on it. And yeah, I remember looking at his stats and being like, okay, these are not only good, but they're consistent. I believe like the 2 years he had on record in the MHL were like both really solid. And I was like, okay, this guy, his numbers seem good. They seem consistent. I'm on board. I like this. And then as the years passed by, that consistency just continued. As he moved up levels, you saw his numbers creep up in the VHL and eventually a little cup of coffee in the KHL until this past season when he was kind of a somewhat regular in the KHL. And the numbers just seems to continue to improve, seem to be consistent. And I think the most important thing with a goaltender is consistency. I'll take a guy that's consistently 10th best goalie in the league over a guy that's the best goalie 1 year and the worst goalie the next year. And yeah, I just liked what I saw, and I liked that it continues to look good.
Yeah, and so building off of that, you've watched quite a bit of him play now just through watching online clips and things like that. When you watch him play, what are kind of the things that stand out generally about his play? Is he kind of the more chaotic goaltender that we kind of see in somebody in the system like a Vyacheslav Peksa, who is a little bit of a wild card? Or there's the calmer kind of Dennis Hildeby, who's huge at 6'7" and is kind of that kind of crease goaltender who sits further back and kind of lets game come to him. Akhtyamov is kind of somewhere in the middle there. What kind of stands out to you when you watch him play?
Yeah, I remember the first few times I saw any footage of him. Obviously, it was just kind of in clips, highlight packages that people put together on the draft. And I remember at the time thinking like, okay, this guy's got some pretty good reflex, pretty good reaction. I at the time thought he was more of a chaotic goaltender, but since then I've been able to watch a bit more full games. I've seen some clips. He had one game at the juniors, I believe, and then had a few games also just when I'm home alone. And typically you or someone else will be like, hey, if anyone's curious, Akhtyamov's team is playing right now. Here's a link. So watching kind of grainy Russian league footage. And one thing that stands out so much about him, and I've said this time and time again, is how boring he is to watch, which I think is so valuable in a goaltender. It's like being an offensive lineman in football, where like you're best when no one is noticing what you're doing. I think goaltenders like Dominik Hasek kind of ruined the position for a lot of people. He's my favorite goaltender of all time. Let me say that. No disrespect to him. He's my favorite goaltender of all time. But like people expect a goaltender to be flashy and chaotic and diving across the net. And it's like, no, a lot of the best goaltenders are just really boring. They're just in the right position. The puck bounces off their pads and it looks like the easiest save in the world. And I think that's what he does really well. He's really positionally smart. He's still got some of that reflex in him. He's a bit on the smaller side, so he needs a bit kind of that reflex at times. But I'd definitely on the kind of spectrum you put there, I put him more towards Hildeby of just he's very calm, very well positioned, has a great sense of how play is going to develop and seems to be in the right place, right time, always.
Yeah, and so looking at last season, he signed his entry-level contract, went back to Russia for one more season, just kind of the politics, I guess you would say, of players signing out of Europe, especially. We usually see them loaned back over for an extra season. He played a little bit in the KHL just because some injuries happened at the KHL level. Played well in those games, got into 17 games, had a 921 save percentage there, but again, still ended up kind of primarily being the starter in the VHL level, the AHL equivalent for Russia, and goes on a great run in the playoffs, wins playoff MVP, wins the VHL championship. Kind of started gaining some momentum, I think, in the fan base just because of some of those KHL numbers. Do you think he's still somebody that Leafs fans might be flying under the radar on, or do you think he's starting to gain that momentum in the fan base as somebody to definitely keep an eye on?
I think he's definitely gaining some momentum. I think most players playing overseas are a little bit underrated because you don't get to see them time in and time out. And like you said, you typically a lot of the kind of recollection on how we view them is done at the end of the year of like, okay, what was this player's season as a whole? How did they perform in the playoffs? How did this go? Where compared to someone playing in the OHL, you might on a game-to-game basis hear about like, oh, this player had a fantastic game. They scored a hat trick. They did this. Where compared to Swedish or Russian or Finnish leagues, we only typically find out at the end of like, oh, by the way, this guy had a fantastic year. This guy was great. So it's nice seeing some more hype building up around him. I've noticed as the season's about to begin and every outlet is releasing their prospect lists, I'm noticing him creeping higher and higher up the lists. I'm seeing him in the just a few years ago, he wasn't in anyone's top 20 really. And I think I saw a few outlets. He was even like around the like 10th to 12th range for a bunch of them, which is great to see. And I'm happy. Like I said, I think goaltending is one of those positions where if you can get a few good goalies in your system, you're happy. And he's seeming like a guy that might be that kind of player. We'll see if he ends up being an NHL starter or a rotational guy or a backup. But I think people are finally starting to notice that like, oh, this might be a guy.
Yeah, and speaking of kind of that NHL upside there and what he could become, how has kind of your opinion of Akhtyamov changed over the years from when you first kind of saw him after the draft and were like, oh, these are some really good numbers in back-to-back seasons at the junior level, now having a few years pro under his belt, albeit not kind of consistently in the KHL. What has your opinion kind of evolved over the years of Akhtyamov? And I assume that you still believe that he has that starting upside as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like as I said earlier, I'm kind of noticing his play a lot more. I'm seeing that he's way better positional and hockey IQ than I thought before, which is great, especially like as I mentioned earlier as well, since he's a bit on the smaller side for a goaltender, just having that extra kind of intelligence and positioning can lend himself really well to the NHL level. If he was more of a reflex goaltender, you can see that really hurting him, especially on the smaller ice and stuff like that when pucks are kind of bouncing all over the place. You kind of need that extra reflex, but being on the smaller side, you won't be able to cover up as much as the net, and it can get really, really chaotic on North American ice. So to see that he's positional and maybe won't have to make those reflex saves, maybe will make his body larger because he'll need to as well, is very exciting to me. And I'm seeing like, and again, the goaltending position is so volatile. I'm not going to go out and predict like, oh, this guy is going to be a future Vezina winner, and it's just as likely.
That would be nice. That would be great.
Oh, please. But it's like I've noticed in the past decade or so, the Leafs are putting a big investment in the goaltending position, it seems, and we're seeing the first dividends of it pay off. It looks like Joseph Woll is going to be a guy. We don't know if he'll be a permanent starter or just kind of a tandem guy throughout his career, but I mean, the fact that we got an NHL player out of a third-round pick in him who's great, and if Akhtyamov ends up being another one, and if Hildeby ends up being another one, then what more can you ask for? Just it seems like the most important position to have depth at, especially since how often you see goaltenders sign for these massive contracts and then not live up to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the depth at the position is definitely something interesting to talk about because Joseph Woll was drafted at the same time as Auston Matthews, and he's only just now becoming this kind of NHL regular. Some goalies are able to break in earlier. Some goalies, it takes a long time to kind of find their game, especially at the NHL level. But even at the pro level, like Joseph Woll was kind of this AHL question mark as soon as like 3 years ago. Like it takes a while for some of these guys. And so we've got Hildeby in the organization that's like 23 years old. You've got Akhtyamov, that's a similar age. Peksa is in a bit of a lower tier than the other two, just for me personally, but he's in that kind of similar group as well. So these are all guys that are coming through similar age, similar time in their development. Definitely exciting in the pipeline for the Leafs, at least in goaltender, which we haven't had for a very long time in terms of like homegrown goaltenders actually battling for minutes. You got to go back to like Reimer, Scrivens to even have like a semblance of anything like this. And
Truly, yeah.
And so coming into the season, you've got Dennis Hildeby. That's pretty much the clear-cut starter, at least to start the season with the Marlies. There's a bit of a question mark of what Matt Murray's role is going to end up being, depending on cap space at the NHL level as a third goaltender with the Marlies, or what his availabilities are even going to be. So for Akhtyamov, the options are probably going to be kind of a 1B situation with the Marlies or a clear-cut starter in the ECHL, which is something that we see a bit more often with goaltenders. It's pretty common to see some of these goaltending prospects start in the ECHL. Even one of the top goaltending prospects in the league right now, Sebastian Costa with the Red Wings, he played a full season in the ECHL. So it's not the indictment that it is on certain skater prospects to be playing in the ECHL. Do you think it's better for Akhtyamov at kind of his age right now to play that full season as that starter in the ECHL, or should he be going straight into kind of AHL minutes, even if it means not playing as much.
Yeah, I'm definitely a big believer in just getting him his minutes, playing in the ECHL. I think the fact that Pexa is there already helps a ton because those two are very close during Leafs
Yeah,
development
it came
camp.
from the same KHL system. It's pretty unique there.
Exactly. Yeah. Came from the same system. We're buddies during the development camp here. Seem to be really, really good friends. And then just having like another countryman on your team that you can speak the language with.
Yeah.
I don't want to give like a full excuse to Pex's bad season last year in Newfoundland, but coming over and being by himself in Newfoundland of all places, like
Yeah.
probably not a big Russian community there. Probably felt very isolated, which hurt him. And that said, I don't know. Maybe there's a great Russian community in Newfoundland. I'm not sure, but just having one other person, I think, will help both of them out a ton. Um, and yeah, like you were saying, I think just getting the minutes is so valuable, especially at that position. While like a forward or a defenseman or any other skater can still get good minutes on the second line, if they're not the top guy, this doesn't really happen as a backup. And I think that's why you see a lot of goaltending prospects flame out, just not getting the experience, and then all of a sudden they're going up against adults and taking 100-mile-an-hour slap shots and don't know how to deal with it because they don't have experience dealing with that. Which is part of the reason I was very excited to see Akhtyamov put up decent numbers in the KHL as well. Of like, oh, he's playing against adults, he's putting up good numbers. So when he comes over here, and again, we'll be playing against adults in the whether it's the ECHL or the AHL, he at least knows what that looks like. Um, and yeah, that's a lot of words to say. I think the ECHL is easily the best fit for him. Let Hilda control the net with the Marlies. Let Akhtyamov hopefully control the net in the ECHL in Cincinnati there, and then have his buddy at his side kind of the whole way, and maybe have a much smaller version of what Boston had with their two best friend goalies there.
If we get goalie hugs in like the Marlies or the ECHL, oh, here we go.
Oh,
Fire
I'd
me up.
be thrilled. It would be
Oh,
great.
that would be absolutely electric. And so as we start to wind down here, whatever you got your expectations for Akhtyamov coming into this season, of course, making that adjustment to North America can be difficult. We saw Pexa struggle with it a little bit last year. You mentioned that part of that was just kind of inconsistent minutes and working more with the development staff than getting games and some of the weird stuff there, and also battling with a couple more experienced goaltenders for minutes. I don't think that's going to be quite as much the case. We don't really know what the ECHL roster is going to look like quite yet, but it looks like it'll probably be one or two of these kind of prospects versus some of the guys that they had last year. And so, what are your expectations for Akhtyamov coming over? Do you think there might be some early struggles, or do you expect him to kind of find his game pretty early in the early going?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the season as a whole, my expectations are hopefully just like have a half decent season, put up like I'm expecting the numbers to take a bit of a dip because again, coming over the pond
Yeah.
and playing on the smaller ice, it's a big change, especially for goaltenders, because all of a sudden there's way more bounces, way more chaos. As I alluded to earlier, you need to rely on your reflex a little bit more. So if he has moments where his positioning is off, he'll need to make those Hasek-like diving saves across the net once in a while if a puck bounces off a defender's skate or something on the smaller ice. So I am expecting the numbers to dip a bit. I'm not expecting him to come over and immediately be a 920 goaltender like he was out in Russia. But I'm just hoping for kind of consistent play throughout the season, not fall into um, where Pexa was last season, where he was kind of below 900 all season. And let me, when I say consistent, consistently decent, not consistently below
I think that
900.
kind of goes without saying, but
Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm not curling the monkey paw there. I'm like,
yeah.
he's
Totally.
consistently an 850 goaltender. But yeah, just have a good showing. I wouldn't mind if the two kind of have a tandem battle at the beginning as Akhtyamov gets settled in, and they kind of, I mean, it's going to be a new team for both of them since the Maple Leafs will have a new ECHL affiliate. But my expectation is he kind of runs away with the starter role by the end of the net. If the team were to make the playoffs, I kind of want him in net for the entire playoff runs. He's like you said earlier, he was great in the playoffs last season.
Yeah.
He's shown he can handle the pressure. So hopefully do it again this season and really be the commanding starter come playoff time. And should they make the playoffs, really kind of take over that net and maybe show that he can steal some games for a brand new team.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I really don't know whether he's going to be that kind of ECHL regular or if he's going to find his way with the Marlies and maybe even steal some starts from Hildeby. Like I could see it going either way with him, just kind of given a bit of the uncertainty just because he's had success in the KHL, but it hasn't really been over a kind of a full season. And the VHL is kind of this unknown for goaltenders, especially kind of at the 21, 22 years old age. So I'm very excited to see what Hildeby can do coming over to North America this season. And I hope we get to see him at least in like some preseason action to get you some NHL minutes there.
Oh, absolutely.
To start the season. That would be absolutely electric.
Yeah, it would be fantastic. And the goaltending position, I mean, part of the reason it's so volatile is how much of a butterfly effect it is through the system anytime something happens. Like if, knock on wood, one of the Maple Leafs goaltenders gets injured and Hildeby gets called up to play some games for the Maple Leafs, and then they need to replace his position.
Yeah.
So maybe Akhtyamov takes over for the Marlies for a bit, and then does he steal that starter role? Does he struggle and spend more time in the ACHL? It's such a whirlwind of possibilities of what can happen in any way. So I'm very much excited to see that we have good young goalies at all three levels right now, and excited to see if any of them kind of take that next step.
Absolutely. Filipe, thanks for taking the time today to chat about Artur Akhtyamov. Again, I said it earlier, couldn't think of anybody better to chat about Akhtyamov. Let the people know where we can find your work and if you have anything to plug as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Kyle. You can find my work with the Nation Network at the Leafs Nation, and then also making some jokes at the Beaverton, just making some funnies there, often hockey related ones. So that's where you can find me. And then my Twitter is at Filipe Dimas, FILIPE DIMAS. And I'll be there yelling about sports in the coming months. So look forward to it.
Awesome. Love it. Thanks for jumping on, Filipe, and enjoy the rest of your summer. And hopefully we see some Akhtyamov minutes here in rookie tournament and the preseason.
Can't wait. Thanks so much for having me.
That's going to do it for this edition of Camp Countdown. Thanks again to Filipe for jumping on the show to talk about Akhtyamov. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for more Camp Countdown. We'll see you then.